it's a very compelling 2 days at the Flat Earth International Conference, because what you realize when you go in is that they're very serious. Going into it, I'd had a number of friends say, "Oh, these people are just trolling. They don't actually believe it. They're just having fun." But when you get there, you figure out that they're actually dead serious. And they're also joyous. They're happy to see one another because they've been fairly isolated in their own communities. And the conference is as much about community as it is belief. And I think those two things are, related in a way. I'm not sure I can account for what allows them to see the world the way that they do, except to say that virtually everyone that I spoke to had an origin story. They had some story about how it was that they had become a flat earther. And it always involved sort of a radical lack of trust in other people. It was maybe they'd had some sort of a breach of trust. Something had happened in their life, and once they believed that people couldn't be trusted, then they wanted to see how far that rabbit hole went. And so it unfortunately led a number of them to very seriously believe a conspiracy theory that every pilot, every scientist, every teacher, every government official in the world was in on the conspiracy about flat Earth.
Yeah, I find it really interesting, this particular conspiracy theory, because for some theories there's a clear motive behind them. For
Yes.
example, there might be political motives. There is a reason that somebody wants to propagate a theory like this.
Yeah.
And then for those cases, I don't find it very surprising that there are many adherents. But the flat earther case, I mean, I really can't think of what a compelling motive would be for somebody to sort of promote this view. And so what is it about this particular theory, this idea that has attracted so many people? What did you learn there?
I don't know. I mean, they don't get anything out of it. And so, I mean, I think they genuinely believe it. But, if you're looking for sort of the material cause of it, what would be behind it? I mean, it's hard because climate denial, you sort of think, well, that's something where maybe there's an economic interest or a political interest. Even vaccine denial, you'd think, well, maybe there's something that they're getting out of it. It doesn't seem that way for flat Earth, at least, to the contrary. It's always seemed to me that they're sacrificing a lot. A lot of them get kicked out of their church. They lose family members. They lose jobs over this. Now, people can have that same thing happen to them over, being anti-vax or climate denial. But let me put it this way. I've come to the conclusion that most science denial is caused by disinformation. That is, that people don't just happen to believe these things, but they're compelled to believe them because somebody is out there creating a falsehood and lying to them. And they believe it, and then they go along for the ride. And it's the person creating the disinformation that's benefiting from it, not the person who believes it, who's the victim. You can see that with climate denial. You can see that with vaccine denial. There are nefarious people behind it, sometimes money, sometimes political power, who are, profiting by this. I don't know anybody who's profiting from flat Earth. I don't know how it could possibly be the case that there's somebody behind it who's benefiting from having all these people believe that the Earth is flat. Maybe I'm naive. Maybe it was there in front of my face. Maybe it's hidden. I don't know. Or maybe my theory is just wrong and it's not always disinformation. Or maybe this is just the anomaly. But flat Earth, in some ways, seems unique. I've studied science denial for decades now. And, evolution, climate denial, GMO denial, vaccine denial, I kind of know where those come from. Flat Earth, I don't.
Okay, well, let's get to the topic of disinformation, which is the main topic of your most recent book on disinformation. People will be very familiar with the concept of misinformation, which is basically just false or inaccurate info. But disinformation, on the other hand, is knowingly false information. It's information deliberately designed to deliberately mislead and obscure the truth, often malicious purposes behind it. How does disinformation differ from good old fashioned lying? People have been lying for as long as one can remember, but it feels like the word disinformation has only been in the public consciousness for a relatively recent time. How do you think about disinformation and lying?
Well, disinformation is a type of lying. Not every lie is disinformation, because I think of disinformation as being a coordinated campaign of lying. It's where, there are a host of lies that are strategically told toward a specific purpose. And I mean, you can find that, but it's not just, random lying or even just merely lying that, benefits the person who's a serial liar. Disinformation is warfare. Disinformation is the weaponization of information, and it actually goes back about 100 years. The modern the term disinformation goes back to the 1920s, when V.I. Lenin appointed Felix Dzerzhinsky as his first director of the Cheka during the Russian Revolution. He wanted to find a cheap and effective way to fight back against the counter-revolutionaries, and he found it in the invention of disinformation warfare. So lying has been around since human speech, I'm sure. But, lying can be opportunistic. A lying can be random or careless. Disinformation is not like that. Disinformation is coordinated, organized, and planned as a strategic campaign.
Mm. Yeah, I find it a little bit hard to get a gauge on how big of a problem the disinformation crisis or phenomenon really is. You mentioned climate change earlier. When I look at something like climate change, I think there are metrics that people look at, and there's scientific consensus around how we're doing. Things like concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. But when it comes to measuring how much of my information diet is disinformation, I find this very hard. I really have no idea, and there's this general sense that it's a lot higher than we would like, but I don't have a good way to gauge it. And my sense is that for many people, the feeling is the same. How big of a problem is this?
You ask the question of the moment. I was just looking at my Twitter feed, in which one of my philosophical colleagues was saying, what's all this alarmism about mis and disinformation? I mean, yeah, it exists, but it's rare, and the people who consume it are the people who go looking for it, and it doesn't have that great of an effect, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas I see disinformation as being much more insidious and widespread than that. Now, you might think, well, of course, he's just got a book on it. He sees it everywhere. But I mean, the reason that I wrote the book is because after doing a little bit of research and asking the question, how did denial get as big as it is? How did this become so prevalent? I started to think about the fact that deniers aren't born, they're made. They're created by somebody else wanting them to believe a falsehood. And so then the question comes, why would somebody want you to believe a falsehood? Now, I don't want to go too far into sounding like a conspiracy theorist myself, but what I can say is that there's evidence that disinformation is more widespread than we think. That is, I can probably name things that you have heard, maybe not that you believe, but that you've heard, that you always wondered where it came from, but it turns out to be from a disinformation campaign. And I can give you an example of that if you're interested. Now, you've read my book, so you already know what I'm about to say. But the best example that I use these days is, most people have heard the idea, the false idea, the rumor, that there are microchips in the COVID vaccines. But, and thousands of people died from that stupidity, right? Because they didn't take their COVID vaccines because they were worried about tracking microchips. Where did that come from? It came from Russia. It came from an intelligence campaign out of the SVR, which is the new version of the KGB, which perhaps didn't invent the idea, but they amplified it, which is where the real track is. In April 2020, there was a story in the Oriental Review, which is an online English language publication, which said any future vaccines developed in the West will have tracking microchips in them, courtesy of Bill Gates, who holds patent 666 on this technology. Then it said share on Facebook, share on Twitter. The following month, 28% of Americans thought there was something to this story. Now, what nobody knew until much later is where that idea came from. And it's now been shown through the American Defense Intelligence Agency and was reported in the Wall Street Journal that that's where it came from. But here's the problem. People still don't know that. I use that example when I speak to large groups. If I can get 100 people in a room, I'll say, well, how many of you have heard that there might be tracking microchips to vaccines? Almost every hand goes up. And then I say, how many of you know where that came from? I've only ever had a couple of people put their hands up, and they both worked in Army intelligence. Now, the idea here, I mean, I didn't have to break into CIA headquarters to find this. It was in the Wall Street Journal, but it was behind a paywall, and the cable news networks didn't pick it up. So many people don't know it. So that's just one example of a very virulent, life-threatening disinformation campaign that was right under our noses, and most people don't even realize it. And I think that is also what's happening for the millions of people who believe Donald Trump about the 2020 election being stolen, and all sorts of other denialist beliefs that you could name. Where there's a denier, there's usually a disinformer. Again, flat Earth may be the exception, but I think it's more widespread than we think.
Yeah, there is an issue here, and I want to get to the topic of just the information environment and the architecture of our information systems in a little bit. But there's an issue here with that particular example. The people who believe it, they're seeing it everywhere. They're seeing it on all the different social platforms. They're seeing it on the whatever news channels that they subscribe to, and then they hear it from you that there is potentially another story behind it. And I can imagine from that perspective, your view and what turns out to be the correct view sounds conspiratorial.
It does.
Sounds like
doesn't it? It sounds conspiratorial, except it happens to be true. Now, that's what every conspiracy theorist would say. But I mean, there is evidence actually behind this. The Defense Intelligence Agency of the United States discovered this. I mean, there is, somebody could claim, well, they're lying. That this is just part of a conspiracy. I mean, this is, what always happens. But there are actually real conspiracies. I mean, there are sometimes conspirators and conspiracies. What marks off the difference between a real conspiracy and a conspiracy theory is that a conspiracy theory doesn't have any evidence, or it has minimal evidence, and then the person covers over it by saying, when there is no evidence, well, that just shows you how good the conspirators are. But I'm not doing that. I'm saying where they can fact check me. They can fact check me in the Wall Street Journal, if you can get past the paywall, and also there were several other at the time news reports on this, which cited the Defense Intelligence Agency study.
There is when it comes to the topic of updating one's beliefs based on evidence. I know you've framed the scientific attitude as one that is open to updating beliefs based on evidence. Something that concerns me, I don't know if you come across this, but if one looks at the concept of Bayesian updating, so you have some prior belief about the world, you're exposed to new evidence, and on that basis you update your belief. One can actually show that depending on what your prior beliefs are, the same evidence can direct people in different directions. And an example here would be, suppose you have two people, one of whom actively distrusts the information source and one of whom trusts the information source. Let's say it's the vaccine example you gave. Then in hearing information, such as vaccines are safe, as an example, that information can be interpreted in the opposite directions and can actually further divide people's views. So how does one get around that? In the case you just put forward, you're presenting evidence, and if one had all the time to do their own research to the same level as you had, they would get to the same conclusion. But absence of that time, all they've got is the evidence coming from you. And if they have different sort of prior beliefs about how trustworthy that evidence is, it could even serve to further divide. How do you think about that issue?
that's such a sophisticated question, and I'm not going to be able to solve the conundrum at the heart of statistical reasoning, right here
Mm.
on the spot. What I can say
Yeah.
is that there is a fierce debate in the, in logic, in people who think about Bayes and confirmation theory, in the philosophy of science
Mm.
about this. And I'm one of the folks who think that um, you're right that there is a sort of a sense in which the Bayesians will say, well, it doesn't really matter where you start because once you've gathered enough evidence, that's all washed out. Whatever your prior hypothesis was, it will eventually be swamped by the evidence that you gather. Okay, which I took to be the criticism that you're making. But as you point out, depending on what that prior position is, that prior hypothesis, if it's perverse enough, that can really screw you up. So, I'm, I've read a number of people who have, um, they've written whole books criticizing Bayesian thinking. So there, this question about prior
Mm.
probabilities, how much they should count. This is all a big debate going on in philosophy of science, and in the scientific attitude. I'm relatively agnostic about how that gets solved, which is to say, I don't have a horse in that race. My claim is that evidence counts. There are competing
Mm.
theories in the philosophy of science about how you should count evidence. And, the Bayesians have got a pretty big tent on this. But I don't think they're necessarily the last word on that question. And I can point you towards some other resources to read if you're interested. I don't want to go searching on my bookshelves right now while we're on air, but there are some terrific things. One is Deborah Mayo. Deborah Mayo's book.
Mhm.
I forget the title of it, but Deborah Mayo is maybe the one of the most important critics of Bayesian reasoning, who has some things to say that
Mm.
I find pretty interesting.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds good. I'll link that resource into the show notes here. Um, someone who you talk about in your work, and someone actually spoke to a couple of weeks ago on the podcast is Naomi Oreskes,
Yes.
and we talked about her book on free market economics, The Big Myth. But we also touched on her earlier work on big tobacco and
She's
their
wonderful.
various propaganda
She is
campaigns.
just wonderful.
Excellent,
Yeah.
really, really excellent work, and obviously Eric Conway as
Mhm.
well, her co-author. In your work, you reference them and you draw a connection between their work on sort of the big tobacco situation and the more modern day phenomenon of science denial and even what you call reality
Yes.
denial. Could you explain these phenomenon and their links back to
Yeah.
the big tobacco? Yeah.
I'm not going to reiterate Naomi and Eric's work because you've already had them on, and I'm sure people have heard it. And they've done all
Mm.
the brilliant spade work already to show that the tobacco strategy from 1953 that the executives came up with was followed by the climate deniers, acid rain, the ozone hole, it was the blueprint for science to know for decades afterward.
Mm.
The piece of it that I picked up, the piece of it that, I was reading their work, and I was reading some cognitive scientists who were talking about, the five um, the five stop lights along the road to science denial, the types of bad reasoning, the techniques in their reasoning
Mm.
for the people who believe it. And I was thinking about all this, and it occurred to me it's the same. What the science deniers are doing following the tobacco strategy is the same strategy that Trump is following when he is denying the 2020 election. Let me very quickly give you the five steps. This is due to the Hufnagel brothers, Mark and Chris, originally, but it was also developed by Stephen Lewandowski and John Cook. And it goes like this: every science denier cherry picks evidence, believes in conspiracy theories, engages in illogical reasoning, relies on fake experts, and thinks that science has to be perfect to be true. to be credible. Those 5 steps are, individually necessary and jointly sufficient, to use a philosophical term, for science denial. You do not find a science denier who doesn't hit all 5 of those. And if somebody hits all 5 of those, they're a denier. And it was the day that I was listening to some, I don't know how much I can curse on your podcast, but let me just say some poppycock or bullshit on cable news about the Arizona ballot recount. After, Trump had made his claim about the fraudulent election. And they were looking for bamboo in the ballots in Arizona because these were allegedly ballots that were flown in from China. So there's your conspiracy theory. And they were cherry picking out the ballots that they thought were questionable. There's cherry picking and engaging in illogical reasoning. And they were relying on fake experts. The company that they used to do what's now called the fraud, they were the fake experts. And so as I was counting it up, I realized they hit all 5 steps. But the topic here is not science denial. It's something else. It's denial about an election. But it's the same. It's the same pathway. It's the same technique of reasoning, right? So the content is different. The technique is the same. And that's when I really got the idea to write on disinformation, because I realized that there was another step in it. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway paved the way for this. The Hufnagel brothers paved the way for it. But I wanted to say, look, this is the same as what Trump's doing now. He's creating disinformation and he's engaging in a denialist campaign, maybe about something different, a different topic, maybe a different motive. I mean, the tobacco industry wanted more money. The climate, the fossil fuel companies climate denial was about money. Well, what Trump's doing is really maybe a little bit about money, but it's mostly about power. But I mean, the point is that a disinformer has an agenda. They have something that they want that is furthered by having other people believe their falsehood. And that's what I saw. And that's when I don't think I coined the term, but that's when I realized reality denial was also a thing. And there was a straight line, I think I even say this in the book, I think there's a straight line from the tobacco executives meeting at the Plaza Hotel in December 1953 and the steps of the Capitol on January 6, 2021. I think it's a straight line of a denialist campaign from there to there.
So you mentioned in your book that for disinformation to be effective at scale, and these campaigns you mentioned from the big tobacco industry and elsewhere, 3 things need to be true. You need to have creators for the disinformation. You need to have amplifiers that amplify the disinformation, and believers. You have to have people who believe it on the other end.
Yes.
And when I look at disinformation from an historical lens and think about these 3 things in isolation, it seems to me that potentially there hasn't been a drastic change in, the number of creators or the creator or believer categories. And I would love to get your thoughts on that. But what does seem true to me is that potentially the amplification category is very different today than it has been in the past. And maybe a lot of the large-scale problems that we're seeing come down to this amplification step. Does that view seem right to you? Is amplification, to a large extent, at the heart of the disinformation crisis we're seeing?
I think it is. I mean, it's very hard to measure how many disinformers there are, but I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same as it has been. But the thing that one notices now in the age of social media is that, even one person who's a disinformer can have a pretty big microphone and do a lot of damage. The statistic I found compelling is that if you look at in 2019, the Center for Countering Digital Hate found that 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was due to 12 people. They call them the disinformation dozen. Now, so you might say, well, that's not that many people amplifying it. And so maybe that hasn't changed that much, the number of amplifiers either, though I think that probably has. But with social media, the same number of amplifiers can get their message out to the four corners of the world, and that's the problem, right? It's if you look back at what happened for the tobacco executives, they had to run a whole public relations campaign. They had to pay for full page ads in American newspapers. They had to, go out and talk to newspaper editors and writers and, get their word out. How hard is it now to get the word out? You go to Twitter or Facebook. If you've got a website, it's so much easier now. And I have to say, one thing that's probably changed is that the quality of the disinformation is higher, especially in an age in which we have, AI. There are more technical assistance. One of the barriers to the creation of good disinformation is to have people communicating in the language that you of your target audience. And that has been a barrier. So if you look back at some of the Russian memes around the 2016 election, they're laughable. They've got elementary grammatical mistakes. You could tell that's not it's not who they say it is. Yet they were effective enough. I think now probably the quality has gone up or will go up very soon. But the corollary to what you just said is that if we're going to fight disinformation, the best possible way to fight it is to clamp down on the amplification. If that's what's making it worse, then if we clamp down on amplification, that will make it better.
One of the most common amplifiers that will come to people's minds is that of social media. And I've read, Pew Research released an article last year that says something like 50% of Facebook and Twitter users claim that they get a substantial portion of their news and information from these platforms. And many people are aware that this could potentially be a problem because, for many reasons, but one key one is that these feeds that people get are curated individually. And that means individuals are kind of getting a personalized view of what's happening in the world, and they will not be the same across individuals. And so that's one problem. But there are many others. And so I would love to turn to the question of news media, but social media specifically. To what extent do you think social media is, one of the root problems or, lies at the heart of this disinformation crisis that we are experiencing?
It's a really important question because, disinformation goes way back. It was invented in the 1920s in Russia, as we've spoken about. But they didn't have the internet back then. And the thing with disinformation is that it's actually fairly useless unless it's amplified. So, the cost of getting disinformation amplified used to be high enough that it was just, really hard for people to get the word out. They'd have the mimeograph sheets. If they could afford it, they'd take out an ad in a newspaper. But, what do? Well, now it's easy. Now you just have to go on social media and they will amplify it for you. In 2019, the Center for Countering Digital Hate found that 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was due to 12 people. So 12 people can do a lot of damage. And, for this, you can blame those 12 people. And, I think we should. But I think you can also blame the social media companies for not deplatforming. So, one thing that they can do is content moderation. They can play whack-a-mole. As they see inauthentic accounts, take them down. As they see false messages, content moderate. Put a little box below to say that, this claim is disputed, or, here's where you can look for more truthful information. And they've done that sort of thing. What they're very reluctant to do is to deplatform people. And that's, I think, what they primarily need to do. The night before Elon Musk took over at Twitter, I checked and found that 8 of that disinformation dozen that I just spoke about were still on Twitter. You can't blame that on Elon Musk. They were there the night before he took over. So why were 8 of the 12 top disinformers on vaccines still on Twitter the night before he took over? It makes no sense to me.
Yeah, but what about the counter argument that says social media enables everything to be put out in the sunlight? And, if you've got somebody or some system moderating content, moderating, users of the platform, then that will introduce a certain political leaning or a bias of some sort. And the views that would otherwise get public scrutiny are not now finding their way into the sunlight. And so it feels like, suppose we could moderate content and moderate, usage. Then we have to make a call about which political leaning we choose in many cases. How do you think about that sort of counter argument?
Well, it's a very popular one right now. Elon Musk himself has made it, others have made it. Basically, the claim is that it's one of free speech. It's one of against censorship. We don't need somebody deciding what's true and what's not true. Get it all out there, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and the truth will out. We'll discover it. People will, in this crowdsourced world, they'll figure out what's true and what's not. Doesn't work. And it doesn't work because in a polluted information environment, it's very difficult for people usually to figure out where that pollution is coming from. I'll say a little bit more. I think that some of the arguments about censorship are disingenuous because it's not as if we're saying that people with wrong opinions or even false opinions that they know to be false can't express them, like we should throw them in jail or muzzle them. All we're asking is that they not be amplifying those voices. The social media companies don't have to amplify someone else's lie. And suppose you were a radical free speech proponent. Suppose you thought that everybody had the right to speak. Well, this comes up sometimes in the United States where we have the First Amendment. And we find ourselves in a situation where the Ku Klux Klan wants a parade permit. And we have to give it to them because under the First Amendment, we have to do that, even if we hate what they're going to say. What we don't have to do then is go down to the rally and help them pass out their flyers. That's amplification. That's what Twitter is doing. So this idea that all we need is to just let everyone speak and truth will rise to the top. Do we believe that in science? I mean, do we want to just let the fraudsters in? I mean, scientific fraud is a terrible thing, and I think it's worth thinking about why it's a terrible thing. It's because it pollutes the information stream where people are trying to figure out the truth. So what if somebody said, oh yeah, but you're just censoring the fraudsters. Just let them in. And I'm not talking about censoring the gadflies or the oddballs with the radical theory that might be true. I'm talking about the people who have cheated, lied, who know that their theory is not true. Should we give them a voice at the table? I don't think there are very many people who would agree with that because it would ruin science in the same way that I think disinformation threatens democracy. One more thing. If Elon Musk believes so much in the importance of transparency, and that's why he wants to give everyone a voice, why doesn't he make his algorithms transparent? Why doesn't he have a board of governors who are not affiliated with Twitter, where you blind all user data, and these experts can look at the algorithms and warn in advance, this one's dangerous, this one is going to kill people. I mean, we always have to wait for a whistleblower to come forward, and then we find out once the damage is done, too late. So if Elon Musk really believes in transparency, open up your algorithms, let the sun shine in, and let's find out what's in them.
Yeah, in one lens, I'm really sympathetic to that view, and I think a lot of people would be. But there is a different lens if you consider these, businesses as businesses, and you consider the business models that they need to run in order to operate. A lot of these platforms, let's take YouTube for example, but basically all of them, in some sense, work on a business model that relies on attention. Or, either advertising or they're selling something. And if you just play through the logic, suppose it's advertising. The platforms make money from advertising. This means they have to attract and retain user attention. And this means that inevitably, the content that does this and the strategies that do this they're going to proliferate. And unfortunately, coupled with our human psychology, that does often tend to be conspiratorial and inflammatory. And so it feels like in one sense, if we're making this ask of these businesses, we are also so putting them at a disadvantage or we ask them to go against their business models. I could think of, for example, candy companies or something. The product is candy. It is inherently unhealthy for people. Yet this is also the product that people are choosing to purchase, and in a way, the sort of moderation that you've just talked about could be considered to be like analogous to banning certain types of candies, and so how do you think about the business model underlying this whole social media issue?
Well, I mean, businesses always complain about regulation. They don't want anything to stand in the way of making profit. But why are businesses regulated? It's for fear of public harm.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably why there's no more cocaine in Coca-Cola. I mean, could they make more money if they did that? They probably could. Look, why are social media companies the only business that's protected from lawsuits for libel, slander, defamation? Under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, they're protected from lawsuits if they leave something up that's horrible, that's defamatory, that's false. They're also protected from lawsuits if they take something down that's perfectly innocuous, but they just don't like it. They have so much more freedom than other forms of media. Television is regulated, radio is regulated, newspapers are regulated. The same story that appears on Twitter, if it appeared in the New York Times could get sued. So there's a real asymmetry. And of course, nobody in business wants to be regulated because they can make more profits if they didn't have it. Imagine a cable television landscape that was unregulated. CNN has ratings problems. They have for years now. What if they started airing public executions? They could triple their ratings overnight, but they don't. And I think that the reason that they don't is not necessarily some moral reason. It's regulation. That would not be allowed. But we don't have those sorts of regulations for social media. I think they're coming. I mean, look, one thing that we could regulate is transparency, what you were just talking about. Couldn't the US Congress regulate Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, that they had to have an independent panel of experts looking at their algorithms to assess in advance whether it was causing, more suicide amongst teenage girls, or, whatever it is that you wanted to check. They could regulate that without the government being the fact checker in chief, without having the government decide, what was true or false, simply to regulate them in some way. I mean, if you look at the laws surrounding all other media, TV, print, all of it, it's quite a bit compared to what they have in social media. So, yeah, the cigarette companies complained when they had to start putting the labels on their packages too, but people still bought cigarettes.
Do you think this argument that you put forward suggests that there is more of a problem of bad systems and incentives than bad actors? Or, I mean, obviously it would be a combination of both, but I'm interested in your thoughts onto just where this line lies. Because, in a sense, if social media companies currently are in a situation where there isn't much regulation, I do find it very hard to believe that they wouldn't behave somewhat in this way, or at least that the product wouldn't turn out somewhat in this way, simply because that is the direction that the business model pulls in. But I'm not sure to what extent this is also driven by bad actors. So what is your sense? Where does that line sit?
I think bad incentives create bad actors. I mean, you can shape human behavior through incentives. I mean, isn't that what government does? Isn't that what law is? I mean, I'm thinking of that book, Nudge, a few years ago about behavioral economics. I mean, you can nudge people in the direction of saving more for retirement by having, automatic enrollment on your first day in a new job. And then you're free to opt out of it. But if you're automatically enrolled, then you're more likely to leave the money where it is through inertia. and you'll save more. So, I mean, we're it's perfectly okay to change the incentives to try to change the behavior. But the question I have right now is, what's the incentive for social media companies to change? What's the incentive for them to change their algorithms if they're tweaked for engagement? They're making a lot of money. And they'll
Mm,
also tell you, and maybe rightly so, that whatever they do, they're going to get criticized. If they do more content moderation, they get criticized from the right. If they do less, they get criticized from the left. They might feel like, well, we just can't win, so let's just make money. But they do have a social responsibility. There are genocides that have been caused from disinformation on Facebook. The Rohingya people.
mm,
That was a famous example. And Mark Zuckerberg, after the fact, said, "Well, we're going to get more language and cultural content folks on this." Well, yes, too late. And why didn't they do it before? Because they weren't regulated. They had no incentive to do so. I mean, look, people people can play within the rules and still make a profit, but if there are no rules and they're making a profit anyway, why would they want them? I mean, why would they want that kind of regulation? So I think this is a case where the incentive, where the incentive's lacking, it creates bad actors. It makes people do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. I mean, would car companies have put seatbelts in cars without government regulation? And I don't know the history of this, but my suspicion is this was not an idea that the car companies came up with by themselves. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that, but regulation is for the public good.
yeah, I think some people, look towards this optimistic scenario in which, the car companies, for example, do choose to do it on their own because it leads to a better, more valuable end product for the user.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people think about business models for media and content in a similar way. There's a proliferation of individual creators who are very thoughtful about their business models, for example. But it always strikes me at bottom, it is always going to be a basically selling attention in some way. Even subscription to the Wall Street Journal, for example, you're still selling something that users want. And I wonder, in principle, then, if it is possible to extract oneself from the human desire to look at inflammatory content, to look at conspiratorial content, and maybe that flips then the question around to the question of individuals and how individuals should be thinking about exposing themselves to information more than what we should be doing about the information system itself. And so maybe let's turn to that topic, because I know you've put a lot of thought into this in your book. With that lens, what do you think individuals themselves should be doing to guard themselves against being exposed to mis and disinformation?
The first thing they have to do is to realize that they're being exposed to disinformation. I
Mm,
think that that's a threshold question. You said a minute ago that over 50% of users at Facebook and Twitter, that's the main place they get their news. If you do a poll to ask people whether they think that they've been exposed to false information on Facebook or Twitter, something like 4% will say that they have, when the actual number is, closer to 80 or 90 or even 100%. I mean,
yeah.
yes, we've all been exposed to it. They just can't tell. So, I mean, the first thing that we have to do as individuals to fight back against disinformation in the environment that we currently live in is to wake up to the fact that we're in an information war, that the people who are competing for our eyeballs are not all good actors acting in good faith, trying to get us to believe true things because it benefits us. And I'm not just talking about we are the product of free, free stuff on the internet, free websites. They're getting something out of us. I'm talking about the fact that we are duped often. People are taken in, go down the rabbit
Mm,
hole, as it were, on ideas that were invented for someone else's profit. That's the real danger with disinformation. The problem is this story that I think I told you about earlier, where the microchips in the vaccines was invented by on a Russian troll farm.
Mm.
Do they care that people are not taking their COVID vaccines and dying because they're worried about microchips in their vaccines? I don't think they do. So that's the problem. I think that people have to be aware that they live in an environment in which that kind of thing not only can happen, but it's actually quite common. That's the first thing they can do.
Mm. Yeah, when I put this to an analogy like diet or nutrition, for example, I think although nutrition science is not in a very sophisticated place, I think there is this awareness that the traditional diets in many countries are not very good for us, and people develop systems to sort of protect themselves from it. They develop certain rules, and it's debatable what is really working, but there are certain things that are known. Highly processed foods, it's known that this is generally not good for you. Very sugary foods and so on. And so individuals do construct their own lifestyles in order to protect themselves from overindulging or overexposing to these unhealthy types of diet. And I wonder if there's an analogy to information diet here as well, where if an individual thinks about their own information environment that they create, once they've got that awareness that you talked about, how does one construct an information environment such that it is, if not a healthy information environment, at least not an information environment that's killing us and overexposing us to these malicious things?
It's hard, isn't it? Because the inflammatory stuff is very titillating and you want to look at it. You want to see it. And I'm talking about everybody.
Yeah.
So how do you self-discipline not to read a story that makes fun of a candidate that you don't like? Even if you know that that story is going to contain a few lies or at least hyperbole. How do you, when that kind of thing is easily available? And you're right, it's just like the diet problem. If you're trying to keep healthy, but you can't really afford good organic food, and the fast food with all the fat and salt and sugar is cheaper, and it tastes good and it's right there, you're more likely to grab it. So again, one thing can be awareness. For the information diet that you're talking about, I think that one of the most dangerous things that's happened is that people have become of a mindset, well, you can't trust any media. They're all the same. They're not all the same. Because in that environment, you've heard people say, next year they're going to find out that steak is good for you. So I'll just eat it now. It doesn't matter what I eat. Whatever I eat 10 years from now, they're going to find out that it's bad for me. So I'm just going to eat what I want. But if you do that in the information sphere, you end up watching Fox News and reading Breitbart, and you don't even know which channel the BBC is on, where, there are good journalistic values and integrity. So I guess part of my answer is trust. Discipline is hard. It's hard to condition oneself to do the right thing, even when it's to our benefit. But I think that once people realize that, you're either in control of your own beliefs or someone else is going to control them. But there are plenty of people who want to show you things that are not true that would be perfectly happy to have you believe them. Things sometimes that can take your life. The diet, I can't stop from coming back to the diet example because I just read something about a guy who claimed that he lived in Japan for 10 years and he sort of ate anything that he wanted. And he was not fat. His BMI was something like 19, which is pretty low. And that he moved back to the United States and he just sort of fit in and his BMI went up to 29. So, in what he attributed it to, I'm not saying this is true, but what he attributed it to was liquid sugar, The corn. What do they call it?
High fructose corn syrup, probably.
High fructose corn syrup. That's in everything. It's in everything. I mean, in the United States, high fructose corn syrup, you find it everywhere. Why do you find that everywhere? Well, Iowa is the first state in the primaries for both the Democratic and the Republican Party. And so a lot of politicians in the United States pander to Iowa. That's why we have corn subsidies. That's why ethanol is a big thing here, because corn has a big lobby in the United States and for liquid sugar. So that's what he attributed it to. Now, I don't know if that's true. See, here I am. I don't even remember the source. I don't even remember whether it was a reliable source. All I remember is what he said. So I'm a perfect example of what you're talking about. Me, the guy who studies disinformation for a living, I'm not disciplined enough to know whether that story that I read was accurate or not. So shame on me. And yet that's how easy it is not to be disciplined about it. I should only watch the BBC. I should only watch the BBC, and then I would be in better shape, maybe. And I should only eat organic food and never eat any meat either. But it's really hard.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of, I once listened to an interview with Daniel Kahneman, who people will know co-wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow, and has done a lot of research on cognitive biases. And I think he was asked, having done all this research, what are your strategies to protect yourselves from these biases, and how much better have you gotten? And I think his answer was not only that has he not gotten any better, but he's probably gotten worse at a lot of them. Just and it's fascinating, and
it's funny, isn't it? I love that. I love that answer.
Yeah. Nonetheless, at the sort of closure of your book, you do present several practical steps for individuals. I think that it's very helpful. And I should mention, one thing that I appreciate about the book is it's very concise and readable. It's not good information buried within thousands of difficult to read pages. It's very practical. So I appreciate that, and I would recommend people who are interested do take a look. Several of the rules that you put down here are interesting. I would want to dig into one in particular, and then I might ask if there are any that you would want to comment on. But
sure,
one that you put, I think it's rule number, I'm counting here, 6, is to stop looking for facile solutions to disinformation. Can you comment on that rule? What are these facile solutions that people are looking for, and how can we stop ourselves from doing this?
I think that the problem with facile solutions is that it morphs over into wishful thinking, where we think that somebody else is going to save us. If we just, we can count on the media, or if we just elect, it's our representatives' fault in Congress. One of the facile solutions is to say, we just need better education. We need to teach critical thinking. And the only reason that's a facile solution is because they're right. We absolutely do need better education and more critical thinking, but we need it fast. And that's not sufficient to solve the problem. I mean, we can't wait for the kids to grow up to save us. Now, some people say, we don't have to wait for the kids to save us. We can do this now for adults. And that's absolutely right as well. My friend Andy Norman wrote a book called Mental Immunity, where he talks about how adult people can learn how to reason better and to condition themselves and even inoculate themselves against mis and disinformation. And it's a very good book, and we should all follow its tenets. But that's not all we should do. We should not just count on ourselves to be resistant to disinformation. We should try to stop the amplification of disinformation. It would be like in a pandemic saying, well, try not to get sick. Yeah, good advice. Try not to get sick. But why don't we also look for the vector of transmission that's making us sick? That's what we also need to do.
Yeah, well, good recommendation. I'll link that book to the show notes. And that's a nice stepping off point to some of the questions I like to close with, which relate to books.
Sure.
Personally, throughout my life, I found that books, there's a bigger bar to getting a book out there than pretty much anything else, and several other quality checks. And so, typically, I think the information that one finds in a book is going to be of a lot higher standard, and that's certainly my preferred place of getting information. And so, on the topic of books, the question I have for you is, which book or books have you most gifted to other people, and why?
I'm going to change the question simply to say, which book have I recommended to people?
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
gifting books to people, I haven't. I'd have to say my own, and that's not the answer that you're looking for, right? Because that's self-serving for a writer. But it's really true. Most of the books that I give away are
Hmm.
my own books. But
Hmm.
let me take the spirit of the question. The book that I've recommended the most recently is actually free. You can get it. You can get a PDF on the internet, or you can write and get a free copy from the publisher. It's called The Handbook of Russian Information Warfare, and it's published by NATO. It is a training manual for NATO soldiers and commanders to learn about disinformation tactics, specifically about Russian disinformation tactics. Because even in the army, even in the military around the world, they don't realize that we're in an information war and have been for the last 20 years with Russia. Russia already considers itself to be in an information war with the West about science, about democracy, about a lot of things. That book, The Handbook of Russian Information Warfare, I can't remember the name of the author, but if you just put that in Google, it'll pop
Hmm.
up and you can get a PDF immediately. And here's the thing, I wrote to NATO and said, can I have a free copy? And they sent me one, postage paid. So anybody, and it's a very thin, readable, nice book that will light your hair on fire because they tell stories in there. The person who wrote it is a NATO researcher. Every single thing in that book was public access. There's no classified material in that book. It's all public access, but some of it he translated from the Russian. Some were, publicly available things in the Russian language that he translated. Very scary things. I won't spoil the plot of the book because it's so short you could actually read it just about as quickly as you could read mine. I mean, it's physically a little larger than my book, but it's small. It's not that many pages in it. You could read it in about an hour and a half. It will change your life in an hour and a half if you read that book.
Wow. Interesting recommendation. I think and NATO is about to be sending thousands of book copies around the world. So
they
sorry, NATO.
should. That should be the point, or people will go for the PDF. It's a terrific. I forget who recommended it to me, but
Yeah.
I like paper copies. I mean, I'm a writer. You can see behind. I've got all these books, that I keep for myself. I don't give away. And then so I like physical books because I mark them up, and
Mm.
that handbook is very dog-eared.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, for my non-US listeners, I recommend getting the PDF and not shipping the paper over the world. But if you're in the US, which I think is about half of you at this point, go for it. Second last question. So nonfiction books, that's sort of where I focus, and my guests are typically recommending nonfiction books. But fiction is often a place of great value and other types of lessons and truths. Have there been any fiction books that come to mind that have had a big influence on you or that you've particularly enjoyed?
I love to read thrillers.
Mm.
I love to read fiction. When I'm on vacation, I take a John Grisham novel with me. Something, and it's now hard because I've kind of read them all, so I'm branching out to other folks. And in fact, I love thrillers so much that one time I thought this couldn't be that hard. I'm a writer. I'll try to write a thriller. Took me 10 years because I was very bad, as everyone is when they start. And I had to take classes and, hire somebody to read my manuscript and tell me what was wrong with it. Wrote it, tore it down, wrote it, tore it down 10 times. And after 10 years, I published my first novel, which was a thriller. And the reason I enjoyed that process, the reason I wanted to do it, is because I think you're absolutely right that some truths can only be told through fiction, which is interesting because fiction is made up. I mean, that's, novel, it's a book-length work of fiction. It's a made-up story. And I study disinformation and fiction and lies all the time. So why would I want to write a novel? I think it's because a novel changed my life, and that is George Orwell's 1984. That was my favorite book when I was 14 years old. It really changed my thinking about the world and what the world might be. And so that's another, I mean, if you want to talk about my most gifted book, I did buy several copies of 1984 and give it to people, earlier in life. What I'm reading right now, I'm reading Cormac McCarthy's last book. I didn't know it was his last book when I started it. And what happened is I basically stopped reading when he died because I liked his stuff so much that it was kind of like that last box of candy, and you realize if you eat it all up, there's no more candy. So he published 2 novels at once. It was The Passenger and Stella Maris. And I read them out of order because I got Stella Maris first. And so now I'm about 3/4 of the way through The Passenger, and I simply cannot bring myself to finish it because when it's done, there's no more Cormac McCarthy. There's no unfinished book by him. He finished 2 at once. So I'm kind of reading it a page at a time, like, you enjoy the candies in the box, but just discipline yourself one at a time. So I haven't read any Grisham in a long time because I'm just spending months on the Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Lee, this has been a really beautiful conversation. Two things before we close. First, could you say the name of your fiction book that you wrote, and then secondly, any final words for the audience before we wrap?
I wrote 2 novels because after you write one, you know how to write a novel. So then I wrote another one. My debut novel is called The Sin Eater, and if you don't like crime and mayhem, don't buy it because it's a thriller. And the other book is called The Art of Good and Evil, and it also, same genre. It's a thriller. So, I've in my whole career, I've written, edited, contributed to, things that have my name on them. 16 books. Those 2 are among my favorite because they were the hardest to write. I mean, there were just blood on every page because writing fiction is so, so difficult. Nothing in life had prepared me for it. I'll leave to other people to judge whether they're very good. My nonfiction outsells my fiction by, 100 times. But there are some people who like thrillers. So thank you for asking. And then the last question was?
Any final words for the audience?
If you have any curiosity about any of my other work, my events, other shows I've been on, or you want to get in touch with me, please go to my website, LeeMcIntyreBooks.com. It's got all my social media handles. You can see all my other books if there's anything that you want to buy. You can see where I'm going to be speaking next if I'm coming to your area. I was just in Australia, by the way. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to meet. I was giving a talk at the University of Sydney, and so I'm sorry I missed you when I was there. But yeah.
Oh, well, next time. In any case, Lee, it's been a great virtual conversation. Thank you so much for making the time to speak to me.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.